this is again another part of the Christmas Advent beer review series, and it's also part one of looking at IPAs and just kind of answering and dispelling some of the myths and any questions that people might have regardless of it. Now, people refer to IPAs, which is, now they can be India Pale Ales or Indian Pale Ales, depending on what people want to basically use. It's actually India Pale Ales, I suppose, the original kind of IPA. And although people see it as a type of beer, it's a type of ale, it's actually more of a brewing process. That's what it really is. That's what IPA is. IPA was a brewing process that was born out of necessity. There were some issues with transporting ale from the UK out to some areas of at the time, the empire basically, or some of the kind of colonial kind of areas that were more problematic than others. We were shipping out ale to the West Indies, the Americas, that type of thing, and it wasn't such an issue. But we're getting more issues with going to India and the subcontinent at the time, is what it was referred to as, and other parts of Asia, but mostly India. And it's because of, one, the climate in India and the infrastructure, and two, the type of beers that were being made at the time in the UK. The two main problems was, one, secondary fermentation. That was one of the big problems. The beers had too much sugar in them, basically, after fermentation. So when they were cast or barreled, there was a lot of secondary fermentation going on, and that caused problems during the agitation of being on the ships heading out to India, that they were losing product, basically, because of exploding barrels and casks and even bottles. Sometimes it was shipped in bottles depending on what type of batches they were. So they were losing product, and that was a problem. They were losing some of these products as well, going out to the Americas as well and things like that. But the journey time was longer and more complex out to India than it was going straight across the Atlantic. That also brought its own problems. But the main problem was just the kind of the routes that were basically used to go, because remember at that time there wasn't what you call the Suez Canal and things like that to kind of reduce time. So you were going around some really dicey kind of areas of water, like round the bottom of South Africa, around the bottom of Africa, you know, Cape Horn and things like that. So yes, not exactly the kind of best areas. So that was one problem, was losing product. The second problem was storage. The problem is when you were storing it, again, there wasn't really the kind of refrigeration and things like that available. So one of the problems is, because of the heat in India, you're getting real problems with bacteria buildup and the beer spoiling. And that was the two main problems. So you were losing product transporting it, and then you were losing product because of bacteria ingression into the actual beer itself while you were storing it, while it was actually there waiting to be drunk or waiting to be sold or transported and things. So they were the two main kind of issues and problems, and that's how this brewing process was set up. Now, it was done in stages. Again, the original kind of IPA, as part of the process, the first part was brewing out the wort, basically. It's known as brewing out the wort. In other words, having a longer fermentation time to basically turn as much of the sugars in the wort. Now, if you don't know what wort is, that's the kind of filtered soup, basically, that you will actually then add the yeast to and use to ferment to beer, basically. That's your kind of source nutrient for the yeast, and that's your kind of final part of what you start off the fermentation process in. There's lots of kind of processes to get the wort, and of course it's basically releasing enzymes and basically extracting starch and sugars out of grains and things like this, and doing boils and hops and things like this. But The main part is your finished liquid before fermentation is known as the wort, and that's what you basically add the yeast to basically start the fermentation process and to make the alcohol, to turn basically wort into what we call beer. So, to get back to it quickly, because it's going on already, but yeah, the main thing was to basically ferment longer and more aggressively to basically get as much sugar out of the wort as possible, so there was less sugar, which would then basically mean that if there was any secondary fermentation, it wouldn't be so vigorous and so severe, and would reduce the risk of exploding barrels and casks and bottles and everything else during the journey. So that was the first part and the first stage, and yeah, it worked. Now there was a little kind of knock-on effect with that alcohol levels of the beer went up a little bit. In some cases not by much, in some cases it would be less than 0.5%, in some cases it would be maybe 1%, maximum 1.5%. It was just not really that much of a difference. And at the time, alcohol contents of the beers, this is down in the kind of like the 1800s, that type of stuff, was quite high anyway. It was a decent kind of alcohol content. But that's the problem. The first myth is that IPAs have got to be high in alcohol volume because that would be a traditional IPA. Well, no, that's bollocks. Because it wasn't that much of a difference and they weren't brewing it. To be totally honest, the alcohol content of these kind of ales, the alcohol content of any fluid, if it's around about 5, 6 or 7%, hasn't got enough alcohol in it to make any difference towards bacteria or anything else like that. So, totally no. So, the main thing was to actually stop the secondary fermentation, to basically brew out the wort. That was the original part of the IPA. The second thing they did later on was to deal with the bacteria problem as it was becoming more and more prevalent. And then people were obviously looking at the point, well, we're not losing so much during transportation, but we're still losing quite a lot with the bacteria problem. So that had to be addressed later on, and it was. And how they addressed that was that hops have a kind of antiseptic kind of quality to them, and the more hops that were added to the beer, that kind of created a more sterile environment, a kind of an environment that was unpleasant for bacteria. It wasn't really suited for bacteria to kind of really take a hold and really multiply. So again, it kept doing that. I'm not saying it didn't stop it completely, but it did greatly reduce it. Now again, looking at the basis of this is British hops, and the hops were done to create a sterile environment, not to actually change the flavour of the beer. So an India Pale Ale would have had a slightly higher alcohol content, ever so slightly, to cover the secondary fermentation problem. But what it would do, it would make it just ever so slightly more bitter, because of course there's less sugar left in the actual beer, because it's been converted to alcohol. And also, with the hops would add just a little bit of extra business, because again, they were using hops that weren't going to really affect the flavour too much. They weren't looking to make a new beer, they were looking to use a new process, so they would make a beer, the existing kind of beer, more suitable for the journey and the storage and being sold as a product out in India. So that was the main thing. So that was the two main stages. So one, you really shouldn't be tasting a beer that's overly hopped. That was a whole different situation that came across from America. Now, American IPAs, I'll be totally honest, they did a lot of experimenting. They took on the process. Now, they didn't need to make an IPA for the reasons that the UK. They just used the new brewing processes and experimented with and created their own styles of IPA. And of course with their own hops and everything else. Yeah, they were getting high alcohol contents, high yields for alcohol. They were getting very strong hop flavours, hop prominent beers, things like that. And of course they started to do black IPAs and everything else. So what we kind of think of what an IPA is really maybe more what an American IPA is, or what I like to call it as an American Pale Ale, because really it's got nothing to do with India whatsoever. Yes, it might use the brewing processes, but they experimented and created their own recipes and really their own beer style. So I would probably say, if you're going to say an IPA is a beer style, well no, I would probably say an APA or an American IPA is a beer style. And there's many different types, because they did create many different types, and they really did go to town and experiment with it. The UK side was out of necessity, and it was to make a product that was more suitable to be going out to India and to other kind of colonies that were basically under the control of the British. So there you go. There's a spell of it. The reality is, it's not really that high in alcohol, and it's actually the hops that create the sterile environment, not the alcohol, to kind of protect the beer from any bacteria build-up. So there's the two main facts about it. Now there's some other facts that we'll cover in the next video, part 2, and that's in relation to alcohol contents and how they went down, because they did go down, but there's reasons for that, and we'll cover that in the next one. But because we've been talking about America and American IPAs, we've basically got a Harper's American IPA. You can try and get a good picture of this, because it's always good for Instagram. So there we go. So we've got American IPA. This is £1.9. It's 5% and it's 500ml. We've got Shipyard, and it's American IPA, which I of course thought, oh there we go, we've actually got a proper American one to compare it to. And then I read the back of the bottle. Bollocks. Yes, they've done it again, haven't they? So they basically claim it's Shipyard, it's American, and we've got all this appeal of this family-owned brewery in the heart of Portland, Maine, famed for shipbuilding and ambitious world discovery. Fred Forsley drove the original American craft beer movement. His mission to this day to take original American craft beer around the world, making it accessible to everyone. Yes, well, he handed the license over to Carlsberg Marsden, and they make it in Wolverhampton. The same place where they make that lovely Scottish beer, you know, the Cunes Export. Good Scottish beer made in Wolverhampton. It's a good American IPA made in Wolverhampton. It's amazing what they do in Wolverhampton. There you go. All roads lead to Wolverhampton. So this is part of a, what was the price of this? I'm not going to do the mathematics here. I think this is roughly about £1.50. It was on a sale right now, because I bought it in Morrison's, and Morrison's are doing it 4 for £6. So I got 4 beers from a really quite a wide selection, which is quite good. So it's £1.50, and of course this is £1.9. And they're both 5%, and they're both 500ml bottles. They're both made in the UK, but of course they'll both be using the proper kind of the IPA brewing process, but of course they'll be using more American style hops and things like that. So let's crack them open and see what they're like, because this video is going on and on, and we won't want it to be too long. So we'll start off with this Shipyard, which is hopefully, well, there's a lot of citrus there. Let's get the pour in. We're getting the citrus, so there will be citra hops and things like this going on. Oh, he's a bit lively, it's a bit lively. Right, I'll tell you what, we'll let that settle just now, because it's fizzing like a bugger. Is there any spill in the back for the Harper's? Biscuit and spice balance with big hop citrus fruit aromas. There you go. Now with this one, yeah, you're getting citrus, but not as much, but you are still getting citrus from this. Let's see if I can pull this better. So there we go. So this is from Aldi. It's part of the Harper's range, so I think it's one of the last of the Aldi range we're doing. Let's finish off Shipyard. So let's hold them up. Shipyard and Harper's American IPA. Now let's start with the Shipyard. Getting citrus, getting grain and grass, which again is from the hops. So you get the grassy kind of strawy aromas, kind of grainy aromas as well. They're coming from the hops. Getting citrus, orange, blood orange, grapefruit, a little bit of floralness. And that's really it. I'm not getting any kind of malts or things like that. Let's try this one. Heads are quite different. Now I'm getting a little bit of malt here. I'm getting citrus. I'm getting more kind of grapefruit citrus. I'm not getting kind of blood orange or orange. Just really kind of getting grapefruit. Less kind of floral. Just a little bit of malt. Maybe a little bit of caramel from there. So let's wire in. So we'll start off with the Shipyard and see what it's like. Very citrus heavy, so it is at the front. Not so much of the bitterness, kind of citrus aftertaste that you can sometimes get with heavy hopped beers, especially if they're using American hops. But yeah, you are getting the citrus more at the front and mid-tongue, and then it's just kind of dissipating and tailing off in the aftertaste. And the aftertaste does die off quite quickly. So right now I've got no aftertaste at all. So I've got no bitterness in the back of my throat at all. But yeah, that citrus does attack the front of the mouth. As it tails off to the mid-tongue, you actually are getting a little bit of sweetness. And it has a like kind of a fruitiness as well. You're getting more of the kind of, you're getting, how would you explain it? You're getting sweetness, but you feel like you're actually getting a bit of the kind of fruit flavour as well, you know what I mean? It's almost juice-like, you know, a little bit with kind of citrus juice-like. And then the sweetness kind of dissipates and you're just getting a little bit of bitterness just towards the back of the mouth, and then it just kind of just gently dissipates and is gone. So it's quite nice in the aftertaste, because some of the times that's where these beers go wrong, whereas they're just far too harsh in the aftertaste and far too citrusy, and you're like, oh god. So yeah. Yeah, it's quite nice actually. Quite nice. Well done, Wolverhampton. So, right, let's get wired in for this one. Right. There is citrus there. I'm getting more malt at the start. I'm getting a more malty, slightly kind of Ovaltine kind of sweetness at the start. I'm then getting the citrus kind of coming in mid-tongue, and it is coming off to a more pronounced bitterness. Not a heavy bitterness, but there is more of a pronounced citrus kind of bitterness, more pithy kind of bitterness at the back. Again, it dissipates quite nicely, so it's not lingering there and just becoming annoying and unpleasant. But yes, the Harper's American IPA does have more of a citrus aftertaste and more of a citrus bitterness. But it does have slightly malty sweetness blending into the citrus mid-tongue, so you get a little bit of sweetness mid-tongue as well. And then that's where the citrus really starts to come in, and then it just kind of builds up and of course becomes more prominent in the aftertaste. So there's your quick flavour profiles. Which ones do I prefer? Apart from trying not to spill them. So this is Shipyards again. That's an interesting one. I would say, out of 5, I would give Shipyards, I would give it a 4. It's actually quite a nice IPA, American IPA. It's got, I actually don't like saying American IPA. I prefer basically saying an American Pale Ale, because they did a lot with the IPA brewing process that I think in their own right it should really be called just an American Pale Ale, because it is very distinctive with the hops and everything else and what they've done with it, and I think it's doing maybe a bit of a disservice calling it an IPA. But I suppose yes, they are using the IPA brewing process, but they have kind of made it their own, let's be totally honest. This style of IPA, American IPA, is very much America's own kind of creation. So I think it's better to be an APA rather than an IPA. But yeah, I would give it a 4. It's well balanced. I like how the citrus is at the front and then it just nicely tails off. It's just nicely balanced. It's just the flavour profiles, they're there, plenty of flavours, but they only go up to so far, and then, you know, so they never go too high, they never become too overpowering or too strong. So I like it, and it's a well brewed beer. Again, well done to Wolverhampton. And yeah, it's a nice beer, and for the price of £1.50, well, I'll be honest, you can't go wrong with that. So that was you before Christmas. Go over to Morrison's and take advantage. I don't know how long this kind of promotion will be, but hopefully it'll be right up and during the Christmas period and the festive period. So get yourself over there and take advantage, because there's some good beers for £1.50. So there you go. Out of 5, what would I give the Harper's American IPA from Aldi? It's not as well balanced. There's some different flavour profiles, but it honestly feels like they've just chucked some American hops into a kind of amber ale. I would say it's more of an amber ale, and they've added some extra kind of American hops to it. And yes, it does obviously provide the citrus profile, but it's not actually kind of, it doesn't feel like it's balanced out like the Shipyard is. It feels that it's a bit of an afterthought, or like they've made a batch of amber ale and they've maybe done a secondary dry hop with it or something like that. But yeah, it's just not quite there. Starts off kind of okay, and then it just, the flavour profiles just don't really kind of marriage up. There's a bit just from the mid-tongue going on to the kind of aftertaste where it's just like, this beer's actually really changed. You know, it starts off kind of one type of beer and then it really kind of changes quite dramatically with the flavour profiles from mid-tongue to back-tongue, and the aftertaste isn't as nice and as pleasant as the Shipyard. So yeah, what would I give it? For £1.09, everything else, I would give it, now this is going to annoy some people because I've had some feedback, and one of the suggestions is why do I not make my beer scores out of 10. Now initially I did them to kind of match in with the out of 5 with the Untapped app, just so people could, you know, obviously kind of match into what I'm kind of rating beers, and then they can look on Untapped and see what other people are rating the same beers at. So it was just kind of make it in line with that and more balanced. But a lot of people have said that they don't like the kind of like the 2.8s and the 2.7s and 3.2s and all this. And they would rather just make it out of 10 and just make it round numbers. So I'm not going to do this with this video, but in the new year, after we've done the Christmas review series is completed, then I will start bringing in out of 10 and see if people like it and if they're happy and it makes more sense to them. But this one's going to be out of 5, and I'm going to give it a 2.3. I would say it's below average just because of it just doesn't really kind of married up. It just doesn't really kind of work. I think it's just like an afterthought. I don't feel that this was actually originally brewed as an American IPA. I think they've basically taken a beer and think, well, we can maybe make a few different styles of beer out of here, out of this kind of batch, by adding extra ingredients and just kind of slightly changing the flavour profiles. So yeah, 2.3 out of 5. It is below average. It's not as good, and for £1.09, yeah, it's a good price, but the beer isn't that good. It's well brewed and everything else, but I think it's doing a disservice to the American IPAs. I think it wasn't brewed as an American IPA, and I think that's doing it a disservice. So yes, it gets a 2.3. Whereas this, even though it was made in the UK, is a well brewed beer, and it is a good American style IPA. It's got the flavour profiles, it's got the balance. Right now, it's also got a good price, so I would recommend going for the Shipyard Special out of these two. So, that's us for this evening. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you'll be able to see the part 2 of the IPAs, and that's going to be British kind of style IPAs. One more traditional and two more modern day kind of styles. So that's all for this evening. Thanks for watching. Cheers and bye for now.